I never thought I'd be the one explaining to a room full of strangers why my own husband's family wanted me gone. But there I was, watching 17 hands rise into the air at once. My mother-in-law had called it a family meeting. She'd set it up like a courtroom, dining chairs arranged in a half-circle around the living room of her house in Charleston, sweet tea sweating on coasters nobody touched. She stood at the head of the room like a judge about to read a verdict, and in a way, she was. All in favor of removing her from future family gatherings, she said, looking right at me. Raise your hand. I counted. 17 out of 21. My husband's hand was not one of them, but he didn't raise his against it either. He just stared at his shoes like they'd suddenly become the most interesting thing in the room. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and let them have their moment. Because what none of them knew, what none of them had bothered to ask in the 3 years I'd been married into this family, was that I was the reason half of them still had a roof over their heads. My name doesn't matter for what I'm about to tell you, but you can call me by what my mother-in-law called me that day, with a curl of disgust in her voice. The architect's wife. As if that's all I was. An accessory to my husband's career, a woman who happened to be present at family functions, tolerated because I made decent coffee and didn't talk back too much. What she didn't know, what nobody at that meeting bothered to ask, was that 2 years earlier, when her husband's construction firm was 3 payments away from foreclosure, it was my money. Money from a settlement I never talked about, that quietly bought the note on their commercial property before the bank could seize it. I didn't do it for credit. I did it because Daniel, my husband, asked me to, and back then I still believed loving someone meant absorbing their family's problems without complaint. That belief had an expiration date. I just hadn't known it yet. I'm 38. I work in healthcare administration, the kind of job where you spend your days untangling insurance denials and hospital billing disputes for people who've already had the worst week of their lives. It teaches you patience. It also teaches you that paperwork is power, that the person who keeps the records, who reads the fine print, who knows exactly what's owed and to whom, is the person who actually controls the outcome, no matter how loud anyone else is yelling in the room. I learned that lesson at work, but it was my husband's family who taught me how to actually use it. Daniel and I met at a charity gala in Savannah, the kind of event where everyone's networking and pretending they're not. He was an architect, soft-spoken, the kind of man who notices when you're uncomfortable in a crowded room and quietly steers you toward the exit. I fell for him fast and hard, which should have been my first warning, because I didn't fall for his family at all. I tolerated them. There's a difference, and I think on some level I always knew it. His mother, Marguerite, ran that family the way some women run small countries. Through guilt, through favors that came with invisible strings, through a constant low hum of disapproval that she somehow made feel like love. She'd built her identity around being the matriarch of the Holloway name, a family that had owned Holloway Construction and Design for 3 generations, a modest but respected firm that built half the renovated storefronts in downtown Charleston. To outsiders, she was gracious, church-going, the kind of woman who organized food drives and posted scripture under her profile picture. Behind closed doors, she kept a ledger of who owed her what, emotionally and otherwise, and she never let anyone forget their balance. I didn't come from Charleston old money. I grew up outside Macon, Georgia, raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night so I could go to community college during the day. I worked my way up through 2 degrees and a decade of unglamorous jobs before I landed somewhere stable. None of that meant anything to Marguerite. To her, I would always be the woman who showed up with student loans instead of a family name, who wore the same 3 blazers in rotation instead of buying something new for every gathering, who had the audacity to keep my maiden name on my work badge because my professional reputation, built over years, mattered to me. When Daniel told her we were engaged, she didn't say congratulations. She asked if I'd be willing to sign something to protect the family business. I did, actually. I signed a prenup without complaint, because I never married Daniel for his family's company. I would come to regret not reading every line as carefully as I should have, but that's a different part of this story. For 3 years I showed up. I showed up for Thanksgiving, for Easter, for Marguerite's birthday at the same overpriced restaurant on King Street every single year. I showed up for the company Christmas party, where employees' spouses were expected to mingle and smile. I showed up for the worst of it too. The year Holloway Construction nearly went under after a bad commercial deal left them holding debt they couldn't service. 2 months before a balloon payment would have cost them the building that housed both the company offices and, technically, my father-in-law's pension fund tied up in the property. Daniel came to me one night, ashamed in a way I'd never seen him, and told me everything. He wasn't asking me to fix it. He was just telling me, the way you tell someone you trust when you don't know what else to do. I didn't tell him I had savings from the settlement of a car accident lawsuit, years before he and I ever met. Money I'd kept quiet, invested carefully, grown patiently, because I never wanted to depend on anyone for my own security again. I didn't tell him because I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do with it. What I did instead was call a real estate attorney friend from college and ask her, hypothetically, how a person might buy a note on a commercial property without the original owners knowing whose money was behind it. She told me it was simple enough through an LLC, so I formed one. I called it Magnolia Holdings because it sounded soft and harmless and southern, the kind of name that wouldn't raise eyebrows on a closing document. Through Magnolia Holdings, I quietly purchased the note on the Holloway construction building from the bank that was 3 weeks from initiating foreclosure. Daniel never knew the source. His father never knew. Marguerite certainly never knew. All they knew was that a private investment company had stepped in to refinance their debt at a manageable rate, and the family breathed a collective sigh of relief and went right back to treating me like I was lucky to be included in their gatherings. I'm not telling you this to sound like a saint. I'm telling you because it matters for what happened next. The years that followed didn't get easier. If anything, Marguerite grew bolder in her cruelty, the way people do when they sense no consequences are coming. She made comments about my city job, like healthcare administration was something embarrassing, instead of the thing that paid for the health insurance that covered her grandson, my nephew through Daniel's sister, during his leukemia treatment 2 years earlier. Treatment I quietly helped cover the out-of-pocket costs for, because that's apparently just who I was in this family. The invisible safety net nobody acknowledged. The tipping point came on a Sunday in March, 8 months ago now. It was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner. Instead, I walked into Marguerite's house to find Daniel's sister Whitney, sitting at the table with red, swollen eyes and an energy in the room that felt like static before a storm. It turned out Whitney had found out, through a slip from her husband, that I had once loaned Daniel $5,000 years earlier to help cover his portion of a family vacation deposit when his salary at the firm had been cut during a slow season. Whitney had been struggling financially herself that same year and had asked Marguerite for help only to be told the family didn't have it to spare. Somehow in Whitney's mind, this became my fault, not Marguerite's choice to lie to her own daughter. Mine, for having money Whitney didn't know I had, and for not offering to bail her out unprompted, but despite the fact that I didn't even know about her situation until that dinner. Marguerite seized the moment like a prosecutor who'd been handed the perfect piece of evidence. "This is exactly what I've been saying for years," she announced to the table, loud enough for the kitchen to hear. "She comes into this family acting like she has nothing, taking, and the whole time she's been sitting on money, picking and choosing who in this family deserves help and who doesn't. Never mind that nobody had ever asked me directly. Never mind the building I'd quietly saved. Never mind any of it. In that moment, I became the villain of a story I didn't even know I was being written into." That was the dinner where the family meeting got proposed, framed by Marguerite as a chance to store trust boundaries within the family. 2 weeks later came the vote, 17 hands. My husband's hand staying down out of what I told myself in the moment was loyalty, but what I later understood was simple cowardice. He didn't defend me. He didn't object. He just let it happen and told himself that not voting against me counted as support. I went home that night and didn't say a word to him in the car. He kept trying to explain, kept saying things like, "You know how my mother gets. And it's not personal, it's just how the family processes things." As if there was some acceptable category of family processing that involved 17 people voting on whether I deserved to exist in their lives. I let him talk until we got home, and then I told him I needed a few days to think, and I went to stay with my own mother in Macon. It was in my mother's small kitchen, the same kitchen where she used to count out grocery money on the counter when I was a kid, that I finally let myself think clearly instead of emotionally. I thought about Magnolia Holdings. I thought about the note I held on the Holloway construction building, a note that, under the original refinancing terms my attorney friend had structured, included a clause allowing the holder to call the loan due in full if there was a material change in the relationship between the note holder and the property owner that the original agreement had been contingent upon. At the time, that clause had felt like boilerplate legal language. It had been written quietly and intentionally by my attorney friend, who knew exactly who I was and exactly who I might one day need protection from. I called her that week. I asked her calmly what my options were. She walked me through it. Because Marguerite Daniels' father Gerald and the company itself had no idea that Magnolia Holdings was connected to me. There was no emotional entanglement to navigate on paper, only business. I could sell the note to another investor. I could renegotiate terms. Or, if I wanted to, I could simply call it due, in accordance with the very real, very legal language buried on page 11 of a document Gerald had signed without reading closely 2 years earlier, in his desperation to save the company. I didn't decide right away. I sat with it for nearly a week. I won't pretend some part of me didn't want to do it out of anger, but I also knew that if I acted purely out of spite, I'd become exactly the vindictive outsider Marguerite had already painted me as. So instead, I did something else first. I went back to Charleston, alone, and I requested a meeting with Gerald, my father-in-law, at the Holloway construction offices, the building I technically held the note on, though he still didn't know that. I told him everything. I told him about the settlement money, about Magnolia Holdings, about the refinancing, about the clause. I watched the color drain from his face as he understood in real time that the wife his family had voted to exile 8 months ago was the reason his company, and by extension his retirement, still existed. He didn't say much. He just sat there with his hand over his mouth for a long moment before he finally said, "Does Marguerite know any of this?" "No," I told him. "And that's actually why I'm here. I'm not calling the note due. I'm not trying to take the building even though I legally could. I'm giving you the chance to handle this the right way, because you didn't vote that day, Gerald. You stayed in the kitchen and you didn't come out for the vote, and I noticed that." He had stayed in the kitchen. It was a small thing, but it had mattered to me more than I'd admitted to myself. I told him my terms. I wanted the note transferred to a standard commercial refinancing arrangement through an actual bank, something transparent, something that didn't depend on my goodwill or my silence. I wanted out of the personal entanglement entirely. And I wanted Marguerite to know, in her own time, in her own way, exactly whose money had kept her family's name on that building for the last 2 years, because I was done being the invisible scaffolding holding up a house that had voted to lock me out. Gerald cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way men of his generation cry when they don't quite know how. He apologized for things that weren't even his to apologize for, and then he did something I didn't expect. He called Marguerite, right there in his office, and put her on speaker, and told her the truth himself, plainly, without softening it for her. I won't pretend I didn't feel something close to satisfaction, listening to the silence on the other end of that call, stretch out for almost 10 full seconds before she finally spoke, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "That's not possible," she said. "That money came from an investment group." Gerald told her the investment group's registered agent was a law office 2 blocks from where she got her hair done every Thursday, and that the sole member of Magnolia Holdings LLC was listed, in public county filings, under my name. She didn't apologize to me that day. People like Marguerite rarely apologize the way you imagine they will in your head during the moments you replay the worst things they've said to you. What she did instead was go quiet for the first time in 3 years. The family meetings stopped. The casual cruelty stopped. The constant audits of how much I contributed to gatherings, what I wore, how often I visited, all of it just stopped, replaced by a careful, almost frightened politeness that told me everything I needed to know. Daniel and I are still working through what his silence in that room meant about our marriage. I won't pretend that part has a clean resolution, because it doesn't. Trust doesn't rebuild itself just because the people who hurt you finally see the truth. But I'll tell you this. I stopped being invisible scaffolding the day I let Gerald make that call. I stopped absorbing my husband's family's problems without being seen as anything more than a convenient resource. 6 months later, at Whitney's daughter's birthday party, Marguerite approached me near the dessert table, where I was standing alone refilling my coffee. She didn't apologize, not exactly. What she said was, "I think I misjudged how much you've actually done for this family." I told her that was probably true, and I let the silence after that sit exactly as long as it needed to, because for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the one who had to fill it.